Hello everyone and welcome to another Delta Green Operation review here at the Great Old Ones Gaming. I am your host, Nate Lost in Time and Space, and I am joined with my fellow co-host,
Innkeeper Vase Odin from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.
And we have a very interesting operation for the audience today. But before we get into that, we want to take a brief look at what control group the book that the operation is in is all about.
For those of you who play Delta Green, there are several adventure compilations that you can buy. Control Group was one of the first ones that released by Arc Dream Publishing, and it's a series of modules. This one is Control Group as a whole is intended to introduce characters to Delta Green, and it's not so much like a beginner book, right? It's more for somewhat experienced players and experienced handlers to kind of create backstories for their current Delta Green agents. Pretty much all the operations in the book are geared to you making a character that is not aware that Delta Green exists, and then they're thrust into this world of darkness. And at the end of each of the modules, the survivors generally are invited to join Delta Green.
Yeah, they feel more like campaign beginnings more than they do sort of beginnings to the game as a whole.
Correct. And some of them are more complex than others, so some of them can be for newer players, but some of them, like Sick Again, is, I think, for more experienced players. You can play them individually. Each of the scenarios can be played individually, and they have their own beginning of a story and a fulfilling end to the story if you want to just end it there. They also have ways to then begin a campaign for your characters, but you can also play these scenarios kind of as a mini campaign. Each one you'd have to play new characters, but the last scenario in the book is kind of intended to bring it all together into a grand finale. So we'll talk about that when we review the final scenario, but this is the first scenario in the book, and it's called BLACKSAT.
But before we get into the review proper, we have a couple of things that we want to address. First, we want to tell everyone that there will be spoilers throughout the review, so if you are looking to experience BLACKSAT for yourself, be sure to send your handler over this way, and we will see you all in the following episode. And the second thing that we want to shout out is our Patreon and the lovely folks over on our Patreon and our patrons who have supported the show over the past few months. If you'd like to get early access to our reviews or happenings on what's going on behind the scenes, you can join our Patreon over at patreon.com.
Or if you like what we do and you want to support us, that's a great way to do it too.
Yes, of course. And without any further ado and shameless Patreon plugging, let's get into the review proper. So, BLACKSAT starts technically about a year and a half before the operation actually starts.
Yep, you're provided some pre-generated characters. Real quick on that, you can make your own and still make it work, but the scenario works best if you use the pre-generated characters, because they have skill sets. Some of them have higher skills than your typical agent in certain areas that are pertinent to this operation, and you generally want to have a character that has certain skills for this operation because it's very specific. Those skills are very much needed in order for the operation to work well. So although you can make your own, it's highly recommended to use the pre-gens.
As we had alluded to earlier, the operation actually begins 18 months before the events proper kick off. The agents are all astronauts assigned to a classified military space shuttle mission. The basis of the operation itself is that they're headed into space to make repairs on a satellite codenamed BLACKSAT.
Yeah, and they don't really know what this is. Because it's a highly classified military operation, there are certain aspects of it that they're unaware of. The handler knows right from the start of the scenario that BLACKSAT was a satellite built with unnatural components that were scavenged from the Majestic program. The Majestic program, for those who don't know, is kind of similar to Delta Green. They're a government program that deals with mostly alien technologies and biological findings for alien extraterrestrial forms and such. So they found these parts that they scavenged and Majestic provided, and they built this satellite, and no one really knows how to repair it. No one in NASA, none of the agents or the player characters are really able or have the skill set in order to fix this kind of thing. What they do instead is Delta Green sends in some passengers that the astronauts have to take to space with them. And these two passengers are completely not ready for space travel.
Yeah, to say the least. And in essence, their mission is to bring these people to space, have them do whatever it is they need to do, and then bring them home. So the operation itself begins at 0800 when the astronauts, or the player characters as they're referred to, get a phone call from a man named Paul Scalzo. Scalzo? He's a NASA administrator who calls them in with a unusually worried tone. Calls them in for a meeting. It doesn't really give them any additional details and says that everything will be explained once they get to the meeting itself. And when they arrive, they see Scalzo talking to a man that they know as Colonel Aaron Woolrich, who is a familiar face, but not someone that the PCs have interacted with directly. He's an Air Force officer who's sort of seen or overseen parts of their training, but hasn't really dealt with them directly.
The PCs, the player characters, they're all supposed to know each other because they're very experienced astronauts. So all of them are very respected experts in their field, and they're specialists in particular parts of the NASA program that they're part of. And so the player characters are intended to have known to already be familiar with each other and familiar with these two characters, Aaron Woolrich and Scalzo.
To go back on the player characters for a second, there are five pre-generated characters for the operation. I feel specifically that two of them, Hamlet and Belton, are among the most important player characters within the operation. So if you're playing with less than 5 players, I'd really recommend that you play with them specifically, and I'll mention why when we get there later in the operation. But them specifically, they have very important interactions with the NPCs that are also sitting at the table. The two unknown men who are named Weintraub and O'Neill. And these are the two passengers that we'd alluded to earlier. They're the only two men that are capable of repairing BLACKSAT.
Yeah, they have, basically, they know hypergeometry, which in the world of Delta Green is kind of like casting spells or altering reality using geometric principles that are beyond human comprehension. These NPCs, these two NPCs that are going to be the passengers, are not just unprepared in terms of their skill level for the space mission. They are also problematic because they both are clearly out of shape and not in a particularly good medical condition. One of them in particular has a medical condition that could be beyond problematic. Even before they set out, the PCs get to kind of size them up when they first meet them, and they almost instantly notice that these two are probably going to be a problem in terms of their medical history.
Yeah, and you could sort of get that right from just seeing them at the table. You know, one of them is clearly pretty overweight, and the other one seems to smoke pretty regularly just from the smell of their clothes and stuff.
There's insinuation of depression and alcoholism in one of them, which are both very common in Delta Green agents because of the amount of stress that they have to endure, the amount of information that they know they can't talk to anybody about. So that naturally leads to depression. And of course, witnessing the unnatural leads you to lose some sanity and go into depressive states and such. So I do love how this scenario presents these characters and their descriptions, because it presents this information like the potential depression and alcoholism without actually saying it. It's like really nice how they describe it and invoke that feeling without directly saying it. They really did a good job with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of this is laid out through in the meeting. As far as information laid out by Woolrich, Woolrich will say that security risks on the mission are on a need-to-know basis, and that the astronauts' main responsibility is to get Weintraub and O'Neill up to BLACKSAT and like accompanying them to the satellite itself so that they can make the repairs and then bring them back. They're not really given much more information other than that, but they are given a chance to ask Woolrich any particular questions that they may have. And the book goes through quite a bit of example questions that the PCs might have for Woolrich, which I found was really nice, just to be able to give you some sort of sense of like what the players may ask and what to expect, or maybe information that you can sort of interject if they don't ask it.
Or it's great for new players, newer players, especially new players who are new to role playing games. They don't know what they can and cannot do, or questions they can and cannot ask. So they may be just unaware that this is something that they can bring up. So it's nice to present that to the handler so that they can, make it easier for newer players to kind of integrate themselves into the characters and asking the right questions. And it does give even the option for making a roll or a check in order to come up with the idea to ask one of these questions if you wanted to do it that way.
Yeah, which I think if your players don't come up with a lot of questions in the meeting, I would probably have them roll just for the sake of giving out some pretty useful information to the players, whether it's just characteristics about Wine Trimbin O'Neill or just kind of general information about what they're getting themselves into. It's really pretty good information, so I'd be sure to at least press some of that onto your players before they leave the meeting. And then after the meeting is a little section called Scuttlebutt, which asks the players to then review the character's bonds and motivations and go do all that stuff in game. How do you feel about that, Vase? I was kind of not off put by it, but it was kind of strange to interject that sort of in the middle of the game like that.
So I could see it as a teaching tool for the Delta Green system. So if it's for newer players, I could see this being a kind of a helpful, like, oh, by the way, this is how bonds and this is how motivations work, and this is how they affect the game mechanics in terms of your willpower and things like that. For an experienced player, I think it's disruptive to the flow of the scenario. I don't think it's necessary because the game or the scenario wants you to kind of have like little cutscenes with each player. They come up with an idea of who their bond is going to be. They call them up and then they come up with a motivation and you role play a brief little interaction with them. Not everyone's comfortable with doing that kind of thing, like one-on-one with the DM, especially when it comes to showing emotion to a loved one and that kind of stuff. So it's something that I think may be beneficial for a new player to learn the mechanics, but at the same time will make them uncomfortable. So I think pros and cons, I think maybe they could have done without it and just added extra bonds to these characters. They're already pre-generated. The scenario suggests doing this because they're going to need that extra cushion for handling their willpower loss and sanity loss and such. And I think that giving them the extra cushion just to begin with in the character sheets would have been good enough. I don't know. I haven't run it yet, so maybe it plays out different in actual play, and maybe it does help the player get to know the character a little bit better, the character that they're playing. So I'm kind of 50-50 on it, I guess. What about you?
Yeah, I'm kind of the same. On the one hand, I do like that it allows the player to sort of customize their pre-generated character a little bit and give them sort of this stake in their character, but at the same time, I feel like it might sort of detract from the pace of the game if everyone's sort of trying to come up with their bonds in the middle of the game, and now you're sort of having to deal with that and like run the game at a meaning like in a good pace. So I don't know.
And that's a good point you bring up. I hadn't thought of either. Is we were just talking earlier about test taking, right, before we started recording. And yeah, some people are good at coming up with instant information like that, but some people, when they're put on the spot, they can't think of something. Like if you tell them before the game starts, hey, start thinking of someone that might be a bond or whatever, and then we're going to do this scene, an hour into the session or whatever. That may be a little easier for some people, but you're right. Some people may not be good at all at coming up with something on the spot. So as a handler, just a quick tip here: if you plan on doing the Scuttlebutt section, come up with bonds for each of the pre-gens, and that way if someone can't come up with an idea, give them your idea and say, here, just run with this,
Yeah, or have like maybe a list of ideas, just like general ideas, something like that, just to kind of keep the pace of the game going, especially if you plan on running this as a one-shot. You want to keep the game, the pace moving. And I think kind of on that note too of pacing, when you're planning this scenario out, and I would also consider whether or not you want to run this in 1 or 2 sessions, because I do think that there is room for this operation to be run in 2 sessions. One session could be before the actual launch of the spaceship, and the second one being the main meat of the scenario in space. I think you can go either way, and it's just sort of dependent on whether or not your group really likes that sort of role play and investigation style of stuff. Because I think there is a lot that you could add to the investigation, the 2-day investigation that follows the meeting. So after the scuttlebutt scene, the players are given the chance to do some research into BLACKSAT and kind of poke around and see what they can learn about what they're getting themselves into. There's various scenes from gossiping with other workers at NASA to learning more about Weintraub and O'Neill. And one of the characters is actually a physician and can actually attend O'Neill and Weintraub's physicals and can learn some pretty interesting information from there as well. But one part of this section that I really like is that it gives a lot of examples of what the players could look into, and depending on how they roll, it gives you various results on whether they succeed or fail. I really liked that addition.
Yeah, because I really like the skill checks in Delta Green, how they're not necessarily always pass fail. Like a lot of the scenarios are really good about making skills matter in a way, or even your role. You may have failed by a small amount, and with Delta Green, the way the system works, if you come close to succeeding, you can still get some information or do something with that skill. In this instance, having the pass fail or the success failure roles and the description of what the agent finds, it's really interesting because just attempting the role is going to give you a little bit of information, even if you fail it. And if you succeed, you get more information or, more details regarding whatever it is that you're rolling for. I definitely did like how they added that here.
Yeah, and I like in this section, too, that if the players fail at any point, kind of drumming up information about what they're getting themselves into with BLACKSAT, Woolrich is privy to all of this, like, goings on, and he basically tells them, you better knock it off or you're going to get court-martialed, kind of a deal.
Yeah, if the agents dig too deep, if the player characters dig too deep, it it comes back to bite them, for sure. They start to realize there's something deeper there that they're not supposed to know.
Yeah, and I always enjoy when Delta Green really plays into that sort of bureaucratic protocol, because I think it's an important part of the setting is to really like establish that these player characters have to kind of follow the hierarchy of whatever establishment that they happen to be a part of. I suggest that, you might want to run this in 2 sessions because there really is a lot of information here that, if your players really want to like have a couple of chat scenes with random engineers and scientists in NASA, like you could easily like spend an hour just like kind of coming up with these conversations, and maybe you have another scene with a player where they're going through the physicals of Weintraub and O'Neill, and like I could see that being like a 3-hour session right there.
Yeah, me too. And if you don't think that your players are going to go too far, or if they're newer players so they don't know like the things that they need to investigate or look into, just maybe kind of give them a little push into it by reminding them that these are astronauts who are the best of the best in their field of study. A space mission is nothing to sneeze at, right? It requires a very particular set of skills. It requires everyone to be at the top of their game. Otherwise, if even the slightest thing goes wrong, everyone's life could be in danger. So it's extremely important that everybody is on the same page. And having these 2 other individuals that are now going to be part of this mission as a kind of last minute addition, as an astronaut, as a expert astronaut, you should be thrown aback by that and say, wait a minute, who are these strangers? We don't know their skill level. Assessing them and sizing them up, they're clearly unfit for space travel. They clearly don't have the training or the health to do this mission. What's going on here? I think any astronaut in their right mind would start digging and say, hey, who are these 2 guys? Maybe they'll call colleagues. Hey, do you know what Woolrich is doing here? Or do you know who this O'Neill guy is? Or maybe even just searching the internet to try and find out who these guys are, a little bit more information. Because again, those 2 passengers are unknown factors that can truly affect the mission and maybe affect everybody's lives within the mission. So letting them know something like that as players will help them kind of think about it in those terms and put themselves in the astronaut's shoes and say, oh yeah, maybe we should look into these guys a little bit further.
Yeah, even if it's just something basic, like you said, like doing a Google search or, doing like a search on Wikipedia, just something in their 2-day time. Like I definitely agree with you that as the handler, you really should kind of stress to the players that this is very odd that NASA would do something like this, especially so close to the start of a mission.
Yeah, so one of the player characters can be Turner. It's Turner, right? Who's the physician?
Yes.
And so that physician is in charge of the health of the people on the flight. So they would be there for the examination, and a lot of the examination results are redacted. So when Turner gets the report, there's a bunch of redacted sections, which is pretty hilarious. And Turner herself gets to see these guys doing their physicals and just failing miserably, which I think is just such a hilarious thing. Something about this section cracked me up because these two passengers are so bad and so clearly not meant to be going up there.
Following the physical, they also do the training scene with Hamlet and Belton, which is equally hilarious. Just like thinking of just two totally out of shape people trying to like do astronaut training in a matter of a couple of days is just really amusing.
Some astronauts never even go to space in their entire career. And these two guys are getting to go to space with no prior training. It's just hilarious. And trying to cram it all in a couple of days. Just something so typical of Delta Green.
Yeah, it's great. So I would definitely have these scenes with your players, even if they don't do any cursory research. Like, have one of the players either play as Turner or play as Hamlet and Belton. Like I was saying earlier, I think Hamlet and Belton are probably the two first pre-gens that you want to make sure someone is playing, and then maybe Turner after that, specifically for these scenes. And then at some point, when you feel enough time has passed, or during session 2, if you decide to go that route, session 2 is all about the launch and actually going into space.
Yeah, the scenario, once everyone's ready and strapped in, the scenario makes it clear that you want to build the tension of the actual launch sequence. So it goes step by step, starting at T minus 10 seconds, and it gives details for you to describe to your players everything that's going on each second pre-launch and even post-launch, all the way up to T plus 12 minutes or something to that effect. And things start happening right away. As soon as the rocket launches, things start to go haywire at that point.
Because of course they would.
Yeah, of course. It's Delta Green.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be a fun story if everyone just went to space and everything was fine. You got to make this dramatic. They give you, tons of great little bullet points as well. And I like that in addition to giving you all these descriptive details, it gives the players the chance to use their skills in these really hectic moments, which I really like as well. There are skill tests that the players have to make at certain points throughout this, and I sort of like that. It almost feels like a quick time event, and I'm not saying that in a disparaging way, but in a really kind of cool way. In a game like this where you're like, dig, 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 dig. All right, now you got to make this roll quick. Hurry up. You don't know what's happening. I think you could really play a scene up like this and sort of have that like kind of constant like adrenaline pumping in your players. It's really great. And eventually they eventually get up into orbit, and that is sort of like they have a chance to collect themselves, but in Delta Green fashion, of course, the radios go down.
Yeah, well, before that happens, one of the two passengers is very likely to die before they even hit orbit, just on launch, because he is so physically inept. He starts having seizures, and his eyes rupture, the blood vessels in his eyes rupture, and he just goes into cardiac arrest. And so the Turner, whoever's playing the physician, has to make a decision on whether she wants to unstrap in the middle of the launch to try and save his life or remain strapped in as the protocol sets for her. So you have to decide whether you want to break protocol and save someone's life or stay strapped in and hope they survive long enough until you hit orbit so that you can rescue the individual. If the player does not make that decision to unstrap and try to help the guy, he will die. There's zero chance of them surviving. So the only way that person survives is if whoever's playing Turner decides to unstrap, break protocol, and save them. So there's a lot of little moments like this in this scenario where you have to stress the protocol, and then the player needs to make a decision whether they want to break protocol or risk something worse happening. Then they hit orbit. And then, like you said, after this situation, whether the person dies or not, that's when the radios start to go down in the middle of the person dying, I believe. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like as they're like getting into orbit, that's like sort of when they get to collect themselves. And like you said, if one of the other astronauts dies as a result of getting into orbit, then the players have a decision to make. It's at this point that they're going to have to rendezvous with the shuttle of BLACKSAT, and they have about 48 hours of piloting to do at this point. So once they're up in the air, this sort of gives them another chance to do some investigation and to do some additional questioning, of Weintraub over O'Neill, depending on which one of them is alive.
Yeah, Weintraub it probably will be dead. O'Neill, it has a secret. O'Neill is actually has a completely different name. Delta Green has changed his name to keep his past records and such from being easily found. And if the players did some digging earlier before, during those 2 days where they were able to investigate before the launch, if they were able to find some information regarding that, they can kind of drill him now about it and question him further about it. And he will eventually come clean.
Yeah, I like his story too. There's interesting ties to Keziah Mason and the Black Book and all that stuff with his backstory, which I really thought was cool. And it's at this point, you can give the players the chance to kind of, walk around the cabin, so to speak, and kind of build this kind of looming sense of dread of, the vacuum of space, and just give the players this sense of unease that something is definitely wrong.
Yeah. I mean, already they're going to have something wrong. Whether the passenger died or not, even if they didn't die, they are in critical condition, basically. So they have a major problem already, even at the very beginning of the mission. While they have this time to walk around, and you, as a handler, definitely are building the sense of dread, then protocol states that it's either the captain or the pilot has to go and check the suits, because a couple of the astronauts also have to do a spacewalk, during the mission while O'Neill is fixing BLACKSAT. And when they start to check the suits, as is protocol, there is a chance that they discover something not right about the suits.
Yeah, they can discover that the suits may have been sabotaged.
Initially, they just see a strange device inside of them. So depending on their skill rolls, success or failure, they can just learn a little bit about that, or they can actually determine that there is some kind of poison in these devices, and there's some kind of remote control, some radio antenna mechanism that clearly is meant for these things to be remotely activated. So someone is setting up the suits, but there is a chance your players don't succeed. They find the devices, but they don't know what they are. So they can actually call mission control or...
Yeah, they can... Woolrich is the man that's most likely to be on the receiving end of any calls that the astronauts make while they're in space.
Yeah, so they can try and ask him what it is if their rolls were not high enough to discover the truth of what those devices are, and he'll lie to them. He'll say that they're just devices for him to monitor their health status remotely from mission control.
But the reality is that they're connected to nerve gas, which has a very good chance of killing your players after a few minutes, if they don't catch it, and if it's administered inside the suit. So yeah, you can certainly just have the player just die kind of out of nowhere if they don't see this coming, if you don't really describe it well enough. So
yeah,
like you were saying earlier, Vase, make sure the players have the chance to at least investigate the suits prior to actually getting into them.
If whether they reach the main orbit to get to BLACKSAT or get to a lower orbit, either way, they're able to reach BLACKSAT, and now they must don the suits and go outside and tether themselves to the ship, and O'Neill goes with them as well. At this point, the players may still want to ask O'Neill some questions regarding everything that's going on. And as they're about to go on their spacewalk, he will come clean about a lot of what he knows, because at this point he knows that one of them will probably die, or all of them. And I think at this point he doesn't really care so much, or maybe because the astronauts have BLACKSAT clearance, he feels that he can tell them a little bit more.
Yeah, and maybe the players use some sort of social skill and maybe role play their way into just getting O'Neill to like them as people. That's an entirely possible option as well. I think it's at this point too that the players have a decision to make whether or not they actually want to go through with this or not. It's at this point that, again, you probably should really stress protocol and stress this kind of weight of this choice to the players.
Yeah, just abandoning a mission like that for pretty much no reason is very, very detrimental to their careers. And these are people, their player characters that they're using are people who have spent their lives building up their careers and becoming respected and almost top of their field, and throwing away their careers like that just on a whim is very unlikely for any of them to do, unless they absolutely feel that everybody's in danger, which at this point they may not necessarily feel that way. They have no real reason to feel that way.
Yeah, if Weintraub does die as a result of going into space, the player characters knew that was a very real possibility going into this. While it is unfortunate, that is likely the reality that those characters have come to grips with. As sad as that may be, but I think that as the handler, you really can kind of play up Woolrich's hierarchical sort of status on the players and be like, well, if you don't carry out this mission, you'll be ridiculed for the rest of your life. And
it's also a decision that a lot of Delta Green agents have to make on almost every mission. So it's something that experienced players will be used to doing, but even non-experienced players at least are going to be exposed to having to make such a tough decision. It's part of the horror of Delta Green, knowing that the life of one, sometimes it's necessary for that life to end in order to ensure the lives of millions of others, or the entire human race, right? So, not that these characters would be making this decision because of that yet, because they're not part of Delta Green, but it is the kind of thing where they need to complete their mission. And NASA engineers and astronauts know how important sometimes, if you're going out to space, it's because it's something very, very important, right? So, but going back to the dangers and O'Neill and coming clean about things, one thing he does not come clean about, regardless, is the fact that him and Weintraub all along had been planning to kill one of the player characters. They had to, because in order to perform the hypergeometrical ritual that would ensure their true mission, which is the destruction of BLACKSAT, the only way to complete that ritual is to use the energy of a recently deceased individual nearby. So they needed to kill someone in order to complete the hypergeometric ritual, which O'Neill still needs to do in order to even begin his ritual, right? So O'Neill has to make a decision on who to kill. And based on the interactions between him and the player characters and who befriended him, who treated him well, he will make such a decision. And if not, well, there is the backup plan, which is why those spacesuits were rigged. Because if, for whatever reason, all the player characters befriended O'Neill and he ends up feeling bad and deciding not to kill anyone and having remorse about it, Woolrich will, because at this point they will be suited up, Woolrich will make the decision and kill one of the player characters or more.
Yeah, and it's this scene exactly why I suggested earlier that you have at least one of your players play Hamlet or Belton, because they are the two astronauts that actually go out into the spacesuits and assist O'Neill in this regard. So, if you have all 5 players, you can choose one of them or choose, whoever you feel is most dramatic. But if for some reason you only have, less than 5 players, then you can use perhaps one of the other NPCs, or I think it'll sort of depend on how your group feels about player death. But, you definitely want to play this scene up, as, in my opinion, this is probably the best scene in the entire operation is, the catwalk of death.
Yeah, the spacewalk. And at the same time, while that's happening, the people inside the cockpit are still going to be experiencing something horrific as well, because they see movement in the cameras and they start to realize something is out there, right? So
there's a breach, yes.
Yeah, so while all this is happening on the outside, there is more drama going on the inside. So it's not like the people inside are able to help. No matter what, they're not able to help because they got to open the hatch, which is not possible to do just on an instant. It takes hours. So no matter what, if they see this happening, they cannot do anything about it. But regardless, even if they could, they have their own problems to deal with. So what is it that comes out and breaches the ship?
It's, for lack of a better term, a derivative. As the operation itself calls it, it's less a physical manifestation, more of just this enigma.
Yeah, it's not a life form. It's not an organism. It's a creation made by thoughts and mathematical equations from people and things, and how these mathematical equations and numbers twist time and space and create this thing that is hungry for more information. It's not alive, but it hungers, and it just has a single-minded nature to consume information.
And it moves throughout the ship and has very lethal capabilities. My goodness. Yeah, I mean, we're talking 1d10 sand loss on sight, multiple times. Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, and any information, even written information, this thing will go up to the lockers, and any writing that it goes near turns into a grayish blur. So it consumes the numbers and the letters that are engraved in the lockers. So anything written, name tags, things like that, everything is erased basically by this creation. And these derivatives are created by BLACKSAT, actually. So that's where they're emerging from. The materials that the Majestic program used to create the satellite somehow have created these derivatives, or it has a way to create them. And it is the method in which this BLACKSAT satellite attacks other enemy satellites. The reason it was put up in space is it is a military defense satellite that ruins other satellites from other countries and such, right? Enemies. And it does that through the derivatives that it creates, which is kind of interesting that they were able to manipulate that. But it grew out of their control. And the real reason O'Neill and Weintraub were sent there is to destroy it, not to repair it.
As the handler, you can be as nasty as you want to be with an ability like that.
Yeah, the only thing they can't do is electrical systems, because the information that's traveling through that is not actual processed information. So it says that it doesn't do electrical systems, but you can derail the player characters, through many other ways of anything that's information other than electrically transmitted information. These things hunger for it. And that includes the player characters' minds, right? So
if I remember correctly, the only way of actually, quote unquote, getting rid of them is by actually destroying BLACKSAT.
Or bringing it down to Earth. So even if they don't destroy BLACKSAT, the derivatives cannot survive in the Earth's atmosphere for some reason. So just by going back to Earth, the derivatives die or they disappear, right? So BLACKSAT, but nobody knows that. Nobody is aware of that, but that is one of the ways. Destroying BLACKSAT is one way. And the scenario is left pretty open-ended in terms of that. Like, it lets you decide what happens. In the end, if O'Neill is successful in his ritual or not, there's no rules to make. It's really up to the handler whether they want the story to go that one way or another way. But the astronauts do end up heading back to Earth if they finish the mission or not, or if they abort it, and the derivatives remain in the ship and they start to to multiply, right? So as that kind of increases the tension because the players can witness these derivatives as they feed enough, they start to multiply. And now there's two of these really deadly things on the ship. And the players will not know that they're going to end up destroying themselves by going into the atmosphere. So they have no way of knowing how they're going to handle these things until they enter the Earth's atmosphere, and then they just go away. And it's kind of like a sigh of relief, I guess, for the players.
Yeah, it feels a bit of a cop out, but I think for the basis of a one shot, I think it works pretty well. And you don't have to have the derivatives die when they enter the Earth's atmosphere. You could have them have different properties if you wanted it to play out to be of a more of a lingering threat. Say if you were to like include this as part of a start of a campaign for your Delta Green group or something like that. That would be kind of neat. And maybe these derivatives are sort of like the foe that they have to keep hunting after they land back on Earth or something like that. That'd be kind of neat.
That would be cool, yeah. There's a lot of potential for stories to develop from this, for sure.
As far as flying back home, if the astronauts actually live to that point, there is roles that they can make to actually pilot their way back home, which not many games actually allow you to do. It's sort of I feel like vehicles, by and large, have a kind of an afterthought in role-playing games, and it's at least nice to see that they
made a lot of use of a lot of the skills. Yeah, I really like that they really use the skill here for that.
And then, regardless of the events, and if any of the astronauts live the events of Operation BLACKSAT, there comes a point where they will be recruited by Delta Green at some point, and they'll be asked to join the program. And it's at that point you can introduce them into Delta Green and what Delta Green is all about, and go on from there.
And there are a lot of story seeds to the Keziah Mason angle. There's also a couple of programs that are touched upon that are in the Handler's Guide for the game, Mustang and things like that. There's a few programs that are mentioned and sprinkled throughout that could lead to additional, like these astronauts, after all this happens to them, if you want to continue those characters, the survivors in a campaign, I'm sure one of the first things that I would do if I was one of those astronauts is look at deeper into these two guys and then find information regarding this Mustang program, this Mustang location, and all these other things that were going on, and kind of go down the rabbit hole of that and eventually investigate to get into what the heck is going on and what the backstories are here.
And the operation also gives a little kind of details into some of the other NPCs as well. Scalzo is he's kind of pegged as the scapegoat for all of this stuff going on. So he ends up kind of retiring as a disgrace, and Woolrich is relieved of command of duty, and yeah, it's like at that point that the players are recruited into the program.
And some people involved are killed too. Like if the players go and talk to them, forget who it was in the story, but they go to talk to someone and they say, "Oh yeah, I have more information for you regarding this," and then like a week later they die in a car accident near their house. So like little things like that happen at the end of it.
Yeah, the mysterious cutting of the brakes and stuff like that. It's classic kind of conspiratorial. It's great stuff.
Love it.
So what are some of the aspects that you like about this operation phase?
Okay, so my three favorite things about this operation are the spaceship angle, the NASA astronauts being the player characters. I love that aspect of it, and not knowing about Delta Green and kind of being thrust into this thing with no knowledge of what they're getting themselves into. The second thing I really like is the two NPCs, the passengers. They are so awesome. I was cracking up the whole time because they're like the typical Delta Green agent. Like they're sent with the players to destroy the satellite, and they're clearly unfit for space travel. And it's just so funny. I can see Delta Green thinking, man, these are, because it says in the scenario, there's only 4 people that have the skill set to fix this satellite or really destroy, right? And of the 4, 2 of them are these 2 guys. So half of the people in the entire world that are able to fix a satellite are in the ship, right? Are sent in, and they're the worst. So I can totally see Delta Green going like, "Oh, these are only 2 of 4 people we know who can do this job. They're not really fit for space travel, but what can we do? let's give it a shot. Send them up there.
I mean, our hands are tied at this point. Yeah.
It's for the greater good, right? And even though they know it's going to be an utter failure, but what else are they going to do? They're completely unskilled and unprepared for this. And it reminds me of like things that once players are in Delta Green, they experience themselves. Like you might be an engineer and you're set in to impersonate a firefighter or something, you know, and you just have to make it work. So I love that aspect of it. And then the third thing that I really liked is, like you mentioned earlier, the large amount of and broad amount of skills that are used in the scenario. I think they're done really well. What about you?
One of the things I really liked about this operation is that it feels very cinematic. There are very notable set pieces throughout the scenario. You know, you've got the initial meeting at 0800. You've got the two scenes with Turner and Belton and Hamlet, kind of comedic scenes, those more lighthearted things. And then you've got the very dramatic launch scene. And then you've got, you know, that the ending climax with the derivatives and the ritual and getting back to Earth. And, you know, it all kind of culminates into that big scene at the end where the players, you know, kind of make it back to Earth by the skin of their teeth. And I really like that about this operation.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the launch sequence. That probably would be my fourth thing to add to my favorites. I really enjoyed that too. It was very, like you said, very cinematic. Well done.
Also really enjoy as a handler, I like the amount of information that you're given as the handler to really flesh out the operation and to make it feel as cinematic as possible. Really give those moments a lot of needed detail.
So what parts of the scenario would you change, or what parts did you not care for as much?
I think one thing I didn't really care for as much in this operation is how divided the players always seem to be. It's always kind of one or two player characters and an NPC interacting from scene to scene. It's never like the players as a group generally making decisions, barring, I think, you know, right after they get into orbit. And maybe when you're investigating, you know, prior to launch, there's like a couple of moments where they might be together. But by and large, the players aren't really together a lot. So it can be a lot to keep track of as the handler.
I agree with you on that one. I think, you know, Sick Again had that kind of similar thing. It's in the same book. It is hard for a handler because you don't want to give too much attention, and it feels like you spend 10 minutes with one player, everyone else is kind of listening, but they also might be twiddling their thumbs and maybe not paying as much attention because they're not involved, so they don't need to be as engaged with it. It's definitely difficult to balance that. And this scenario, there's no way to not split the group up.
And a lot of the scenes are tailored towards particular player characters too. So it's not like you can very easily kind of have, you know, all the players in those particular scenes at that time anyway, because of how the operation sort of works. You're always kind of having to divide the group, which is also kind of a strength of the scenario too, in a way, because you have to split the players up so much, it gives you the power to kind of overwhelm them, because you can kind of flank them from multiple angles. And while I do think that can be fun, I do also have my issues with the derivatives, because while they are interesting from a conceptual standpoint, they're not a very easy threat to really realize and to combat as the players. The players like really don't have any way of dealing with these things other than just getting the hell out of there. And that can be kind of hit or miss with me sometimes.
This is why I say that generally the scenarios in Control Group are not for newer players, even though they are for new agents. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone when we say that, because newer players that are new to this type of game may not be used to the likelihood of defeat or the likelihood of their character dying so easily. And I feel like the scenarios in Control Group in general are very deadly. Like more deadly than your typical Delta Green scenario. I mean, maybe one or two exceptions there, but here it's like you said, there's no way that not a single player character dies. Like that is so unlikely. Someone is going to die or everyone's going to die.
It's like the derivatives, they blast you with a ton of sanity, and the players may not even ever see them, like ever see them coming. So, I think as the handler, you got to be careful with that, because it could be very easy to just, TPK your whole party and sort of leave them like stranded on the ship without this kind of nice payoff at the end.
Yeah, and some people are okay with that, but I think most people, especially if you're new to the game, that happening might be just enough to turn you off from ever playing Delta Green again. And it would be unfortunate. Only because if it's a deadly scenario and you at least stand a chance, or you have ways to combat the enemy, that's one thing. But in this particular scenario, you're in the middle, you're in outer space, you're in a ship. There's nowhere you can go, and there's no way for you to battle these things that are attacking you. If you have the spacesuits, if you didn't notice the nerve gas mechanism and you don the spacesuit, there's literally nothing that you can do once they push that button to kill your character. It almost feels unfair. Most other Delta Green scenarios, and again, this is why I say it's not necessarily for new players, because other Delta Green scenarios, there are ways to escape, run away, defeat the things. There are certain things that you can do. Here, there's not much that you can do at all. It just kind of happens.
Yeah, and it's not, like, I don't mind, like, having powerful threats. I mind when the players don't have many options, or when the only options are run away, because it sort of just, in my opinion at least, it sort of leads to this gameplay where the players in the back of their mind are thinking like, all right, how do I disengage from the scenario, because that's how my character lives. And for me at least, I want my players to feel like they're in the scenario. So I think there is a way that you could have these derivatives be threatening, but not have them be sort of like this sort of enigmatic threat that the players can't deal with. Like, maybe give them some weakness, whether it is like, getting them out of the airlock and exposing them to oxygen or something, something along those lines that you can give the players at least a little glimmer of hope.
Yeah, or disable them. So, you have something be able to disable them, not necessarily kill these things, because you also don't want to turn into a D&D scenario or something, but
Right,
but at least to buy you some time to survive, or to,
I guess it's kind of like the xenomorph and the flamethrower, right?
Yeah, this campaign, or this scenario, I think, for me, overall, I agree with you on that one. Mostly what I would change is that I get what the scenario is intending to do. It's meant to be an origin story for the survivors, how they got into Delta Green. But because you don't know who's going to survive, or if anyone's going to survive, you're kind of up in the air about it,
Yeah, and normally I wouldn't have such a big deal with a monster like this at the end of the scenario, but I feel like it kind of takes away from the cooler part of the scenario, which is sort of the intrigue of O'Neill and Weintraub, right? Like that to me is sort of a more interesting crux of this scenario, and I feel like the derivatives, while they are interesting in their own right, I do feel like they kind of take away from that, in a sense. Like, it feels to me like it was like they kind of tacked them on at the end to ensure that the players inside the ship had something to do, rather than having some general like intrigue for them to also deal with. I don't know. It's just kind of my little nitpick with this scenario. I would probably still include the derivatives, but I would probably give them some sort of weakness that the players can exploit, at least temporarily.
I think that's a good idea, a good tip. This scenario is very linear. Unlike Sick Again, I keep mentioning it because it's in the same book. Sick Again is a very open kind of sandboxy type of scenario. This one is more linear. Like, there's not a whole lot you can do. The first half, where you can investigate and call around and meet, with colleagues and things like that, is a little more open. But once they're in the ship, it's extremely linear. Things are happening at particular times. Events are occurring, whether the players are going to do anything about them or not. The events occur, right? So it's very, very, very linear. Not that that's a bad thing, but something to keep in mind. And a tip I would give in regards to that, this scenario, unlike others where you kind of want to encourage people to come up with ideas of what the characters are going to do next, you want to keep this one moving. You want to make sure that, like you mentioned, the cinematic nature of it, so that feels more flavorful. you want to keep things moving very, very quickly and steadily. You don't want to rush players, but you also don't want to leave it where they're sitting around thinking and it slows the pace down. This type of scenario requires more of a structured, like, okay, this is happening now. What are you guys doing? All right, this is happening now. As much as that feels like a railroad, this type of scenario, I think, benefits from the linear nature that it has, but it is important to not let it drag in certain spots, because then the players will feel like, why was I railroaded into this? If you keep it moving, then they're distracted because new information keeps coming at them, and they won't mind it as much because it's like they're sitting watching a movie, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and another thing to kind of keep on that tip as well is, you can constantly remind them that they're on a mission from NASA, right? They have a very set job to do and go home because, time is money in this case. So, you got to keep things moving along. And I like also to suggest that, try not to focus too much on one particular part of the group because, like we were saying earlier, the scenario does really like to divide the players up a lot. So it can be very easy to kind of over focus on the players that are kind of near O'Neill or near near whatever current threat is happening. And, just to kind of highlight that you want to make sure that you're not shining the spotlight too brightly on one particular player when you're playing this operation.
And on that same note, regarding O'Neill and Weintraub, there are times in the scenario, early in the scenario, where the players will certainly feel there's something off about these guys. And because these two guys are planning to kill one of the player characters, they're going to give off some vibes, right? And the player characters may pick up on the fact that they're not getting all the information because something else is happening that might put them in danger. And I know for a fact my group, my Wednesday group, would definitely, without question, once the launch happens, the minute Weintraub dies or nearly dies, they would surround O'Neill and they would question him or beat him up until he answers questions. That's just the way my players go. And I know there's a lot of groups that would do something like that. It's very important to remind them that that their player characters are astronauts, not, warriors and monks and all this stuff, right? And as astronauts, they have a mission to fulfill, and it's very important to remind them when they start behaving that way, remind them that they're part of a military operation. There's a lot of things they're not going to be privy to. There's a lot of things that they don't have access to in terms of their classification level, right? So if they start to get too aggressive with the NPCs, which can very, very likely happen before any of the events occur, make sure you constantly remind them that they have protocols that they have to follow, that they have a superior that they have to answer to. They can't just go around beating up passengers that clearly have a higher access level for classified information than they do, right? Reminding them of that constantly. If they do start to get aggressive or suspicious of these NPCs, there's not much they can do regarding their suspicions because they have this mission and they have superior officers to answer to.
So, wrapping up this review, Vase, overall, what do you think about BLACKSAT?
I think it's an okay scenario. There are definitely a lot of things that one has to think about. An inexperienced handler and inexperienced players may have a hard time with this one. So I think overall, players who like a more linear story would enjoy this. Players who don't mind much more difficult scenarios would enjoy this, and players who want something a little different with a lot more skill checks and are rewarded for being more creative with their current skill set, I think would enjoy this as well. So like kind of like solving a puzzle, but also those players who don't mind having the rug swept from under them. And so overall, I think it's an okay scenario, but it's definitely not for everybody.
Yeah, I think I sit somewhere right there with you. I think this scenario has a lot of potential, but I do think, like you were saying, it's very group dependent. And I think like how your players react to having agency removed from them and how they choose to react to that might sour their opinion on this operation a bit. I do think that there are ways that you can sort of alleviate that, whether it's, removing the derivatives or giving them more agency on how they choose to combat the derivatives, or even giving them more options to investigate early on so that they can kind of learn more about what is really happening with BLACKSAT. I like that there is room for this operation to grow, whether you want to expand in more detail about BLACKSAT. Maybe you have some operations like kind of leading into BLACKSAT where your players are like familiarizing with each other. Like maybe you kind of role play out the beginning 15 months in some regard, and then you start into the operation proper. I like that there's options, and then with every operation in control group, you have this kind of epilogue that leads into a natural kind of opening into a proper Delta Green campaign.
And if you plan on running the book as a mini campaign, then obviously this is the one you'd start with, and it's a good start to that whole story at the end. We'll get to that when we get to the review for that scenario, but I do like that it definitely has the possibilities for all these beginnings of other campaigns and to be played as a standalone type of scenario as well.
Yeah, I think overall it's a pretty good scenario, but I definitely wouldn't recommend it, like we were saying earlier, to newer groups getting into Delta Green for the first time. I do think that there are better operations for kind of learning the game and kind of getting to grips with what Delta Green is all about without having it be so blatantly brutal. If you're a more experienced group and you're looking for a bit more of a challenge, maybe pick this one up and see if it's right for your group. But if you're a newer group looking for an operation to just get your players into Delta Green, I think I would recommend Sick Again over an operation like BLACKSAT. I think the two are very similar in their structure, but I think Sick Again gives the players much more agency in how they combat the threat in that operation. And if you're curious about that operation, we have reviewed that operation, so we'll be sure to post a link to that as well, as this will be accompanying that review for our overall review of Control Group. Well, I think with that's going to do it for our review of BLACKSAT and our second operation review for Control Group. I've been your host, Nate, lost in time and space, and I was joined with this evening
Innkeeper Vase Odin from the Twisted Tentacle Inn.